She lost her daughter to the stars. A human brought her back. The day Mara Vasquez lost her daughter, there were no screams, no explosion, no ransacked bedroom or shattered window. There was only a white gallery wall, a painting that should not have moved, and then nothing. Just the absence of a 9-year-old girl who had been standing right there, close enough to touch. The painting had been hanging in the Holt Institute of Contemporary Art for 6 weeks before it took Lena. Gallery staff described it as a recent acquisition, donated anonymously through an offshore holding company with no traceable origin. It measured 4 feet by 6. The subject, if you could call it that, was a rectangle of pure white, not painted white, the way a canvas gets covered, but white in the way that a hole in a wall is not the same as the wall. People who stood close enough reported mild vertigo. A few said the corners of it seemed to breathe. None of them vanished into it, because none of them reached out and touched the surface the way a 9-year-old girl will always, inevitably, despite every instruction to the contrary, reach out and touch the thing she is told not to touch. Mara was 12 feet away when it happened. She had been reading the placard beside a sculpture and turned just in time to see the white light swallow her daughter whole, not violently, but the way water accepts a pebble. A small displacement, a brief shimmer, and then the surface closed again like it had never been disturbed. The police took a report. The gallery was evacuated, the painting examined. It was, they determined after 3 days of forensic analysis, a canvas with white paint on it. The FBI opened a missing persons file. An art authentication firm flew in from New York and spent 2 weeks documenting nothing. The painting was eventually sealed in a crate and transferred to a federal evidence warehouse in Tucson, Arizona, where it sat in the dark for 11 months without incident. Mara sat in the dark too. She quit her job as an environmental surveyor. She stopped answering her phone. She ate when she remembered to and slept when her body simply gave out. She kept Lena's room exactly as it was, the planet mobile turning slowly above a made bed, the collection of smooth river stones arranged by color along the windowsill, the smell of the lavender shampoo that had nearly faded now. She would sit in the doorway sometimes and look at the room like it was a painting she was trying to understand. Some abstract work with a solid message she could almost read, if she just found the right angle. It was the painter who found her. She did not expect that. His name was Desmond Okafor, and he was not supposed to be at the warehouse in Tucson. He was supposed to be at a residency in Portugal, completing a series of monochromatic landscapes that his agent had already pre-sold to 3 collectors. Instead, he was in Arizona at 2 in the morning, having driven straight through from Los Angeles after reading Mara's original police report, which a friend at Interpol had sent him as a professional courtesy that the friend was going to deeply regret. Desmond was 41 years old and had been a painter for 20 of them, and in that time he had developed what he privately called a sensitivity, not to the supernatural, which he did not believe in, but to work, to the presence inside certain images of something that wanted to be seen. He had learned early that not all art was made by human hands, because not all art had arrived in the way human hands make things. Some pieces had a trajectory. Some pieces had intent. He had been cataloging them quietly for a decade and a half, and the Holt Institute acquisition was the clearest case he had ever found. He had contacts. He had favors owed. He had, when pressed, a quiet and determined manner that caused people in authority to hand him things they were not supposed to hand him. He got into the warehouse at 2 in the morning with a borrowed access card, a UV light, and a notebook. He spent 3 hours examining the painting. He took measurements. He documented the microgeometry of the surface with a macro lens. He noted that the white of the canvas was not uniform under ultraviolet, that it contained deep, nested patterns of structured geometry, not random, not decorative, but recursive in a way that suggested information. A map, he thought, or an address. He photographed everything, replaced the crate, and drove to a diner at the edge of Tucson where he ordered coffee and eggs and called Mara Vasquez on a number he should not have had. She answered on the first ring because she no longer slept. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, "my name is Desmond Acaffer. I'm an artist and I think I know what happened to your daughter. I think she went somewhere, not nowhere. And I think the painting is a door." Silence on the line. "Then you have 30 seconds to convince me you're not a predator or a lunatic before I hang up." He liked her immediately. He told her what he had found. He told her about the geometry under UV, about the recursive patterns that matched loosely but unmistakably, a structural framework he had first encountered in a piece from a gallery in Osaka 6 years ago. That piece had also vanished. So had the visitor who had touched it. So had, 3 months later, a piece in Copenhagen. He had been following a thread for years, a quiet disappearance trail that no official body had connected, because the cases were scattered across 9 countries, and no one was looking for the pattern he was looking for. "You've been tracking this," Mara said. It was not a question. "For a long time," he said. "I didn't know what it was for a long time. I thought I was cataloging alien art. I didn't know it was also a collection system." Another silence. "Then how do we get her back?" He drove to Albuquerque, where Mara was staying in the house she had grown up in. She met him at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a grip that could have cracked bone when she shook his hand. He set his notebook on her kitchen table and they talked until dawn, and then they talked more, and by the end of it they had something that was almost a plan. The plan had 3 parts, and all 3 of them were insane, and all 3 of them were necessary. The first part was learning to read the geometry. Desmond had spent years translating the structural language embedded in the pieces he had documented. He was not a linguist or a mathematician, but he was a painter, which meant he had a native fluency in the syntax of visual space that proved, in the end, more useful than either. He understood that what looked like abstract geometry was actually a layered notation, positions and angles that described locations, not in coordinates that mapped onto human astronomical models, but in terms of relational space, the kind of mathematics that described where something was in relation to everything else rather than in relation to a fixed point. He had been working on a translation framework for 2 years. He was close. He needed Mara's survey data from 11 years of environmental work to finish it, specifically her archive of deep subsurface geological readings, which contained, embedded in the data she had never thought to look at in this particular way, a set of naturally occurring geometric resonances that served as reference keys. Mara pulled the drives out of a storage box in her bedroom closet. She had almost thrown them away 3 months ago. She had told herself she was going to. She had not. They worked for 6 weeks in her kitchen. Desmond painted constantly, not finished pieces, but working diagrams, translations, attempts. The kitchen walls filled up with paper taped at every angle. Mara came to understand the notation with a speed that surprised both of them, that spatial logic bending naturally into her surveyor's mind. They ate takeout and argued about translation choices and drank too much coffee and did not sleep much, and slowly the language opened. It described a species that called themselves in their own notation, something that translated approximately as the curators, an ancient intelligence non-biological that existed primarily as structured energy entities that had, over what appeared to be geological timescales, developed the practice of collecting, not resources, not territory, not slaves or labor, art, living art, conscious experience. They moved through the universe placing apertures. The paintings were apertures, in locations where they identified what they had cataloged as high-value experiential sources. When a being passed through an aperture, they did not die. They were archived, stored in a constructed space of the curator's design, a vast dimensional holding that the notation described in terms Desmond translated after 3 days of iteration as the exhibition. They're not a conquering species, Mara said, staring at the translation. They're a museum. And your daughter is one of the exhibits, Desmond said, and immediately regretted the phrasing and started to say so, and Mara held up one hand. Don't, she said. It's accurate, keep working. The second part of the plan was building a way in. The apertures they had now established were not one way. The curators had designed them with a return function, but the return function required a specific signal, a structured pattern transmitted through the surface of the aperture that would cause it to open from the outside. The curator's notation described this process in terms of what Desmond translated as resonant authentication. The outside party would need to generate a pattern that matched the internal resonance signature of the archived subject closely enough to trigger the retrieval sequence. In plain terms, you needed to prove you knew the person on the other side, and you needed to prove it not in words or photographs or legal documentation, but in a language the curators understood. You needed to prove it in pattern. In art. Mara sat with this for a long time. Then she got up and walked to Lena's room and stood in the doorway the way she had been standing for 11 months, looking at the planet Mobile and the river stones and the particular arrangement of stuffed animals on the shelf that Lena had maintained with absolute consistency since she was 4 years old. Always the elephant in front. Always the wolf to the left of the elephant. Always the small ceramic bird that had belonged to Mara's mother sitting slightly apart from the others, not part of the group, but watching it. She came back to the kitchen. I can give you everything you need, she said. She talked for 4 hours. Everything she could remember about Lena, not the biographical facts, not the vital statistics, but the pattern of her. The specific way she tilted her head when she was uncertain. The fact that she always tasted food before it was finished cooking and always had an opinion. The humming, constant, low, a tune that was never the same twice but always in the same key, D minor. It had taken Mara a year to identify it. The ritual with the river stones, which Lena had begun at age 5 after reading about the Japanese practice of finding stones with natural holes through them. Stones that were said to allow you to see what was true. She hadn't been able to find any holed stones at the river near their house, so she had arranged the solid ones by color instead, and called them the next best thing. Desmond listened and took notes, and then he painted. He painted for 9 days without stopping except to sleep in 2-hour fragments. He painted in the notation of the curators, which he was now fluent enough in to speak as well as read, and he wove into its grammar everything Mara had given him, the head tilt, the food tasting, the hum in D minor, the stones, the wolf to the left of the elephant. He painted Lena not as she looked but as she was, the specific weight of her presence, the geometry of her attention, the frequency of her love. He painted the way his mother had once told him that music was not sound but mathematics, that the body recognized as emotion. He had never made anything like it. He did not know if he could make anything like it again. He felt, when he was finished, the way he imagined surgeons felt when they had gone as far as their skill would take them, and the rest was up to something else. The third part of the plan was finding an aperture that was still active. The Tucson aperture had been sealed when it was crated. The Osaka piece had been destroyed when the gallery suffered a fire 18 months after the disappearance. The Copenhagen piece had been acquired by a private collector who had since died, and the estate's inventory listed it as missing. But Desmond's files contained records of 7 other pieces in his catalog that were still, as far as he knew, in existence. 6 of them were in institutional collections. 1 was in a private home. The private home was in rural Montana, owned by a retired mining engineer named Carl Westing, who had purchased the piece at an estate sale in 1987 for $40 because he liked the white. He had lived with it in his living room for nearly 40 years. He was in excellent health. He had touched the painting once, the day he bought it, and nothing had happened, which Desmond's translation now explained. The apertures only activated for conscious subjects who had not previously triggered them, and Carl's first contact had apparently registered him as a non-valid subject by criteria the notation did not explain. Mara called Carl Westing on a Tuesday morning. He was a quiet man who said little and listened carefully, and at the end of her explanation he said, "Well, I always thought there was something strange about that painting," and agreed to let them come. They drove to Montana in Desmond's truck. The painting was in Carl's living room above a fireplace that had not been used in years, between a photograph of Carl's late wife and a mounted fish that Carl had caught in 1974 and kept because of the size. The room smelled like wood and old coffee and something faintly mineral, the way old stone smells. The painting looked exactly like the others, that specific not white, that suggestion of depth that did not resolve into anything you could name. Desmond took out the canvas he had made and stood in front of Carl's painting with it. He looked at the two surfaces for a long time. "The transmission is contact-based," he said. "I need to press this against the aperture and hold it for as long as it takes. I don't know how long that is. The notation suggests it could be immediate. It could take hours." "What happens when it opens?" Mara asked. "The notation says the archived subject is returned through the aperture. That's the retrieval function. The match signal pulls them back." He paused. "It also says the aperture closes immediately afterward. There's no indication that anything else comes through." "But you don't know what it's like in there. What Lena has experienced. How she—" Mara stopped. She had been stopping mid-sentence more often in the past few weeks, not because she had run out of words, but because the words kept arriving at places she wasn't ready to go. "I don't know," Desmond said. "The notation doesn't describe the interior of the exhibition. Only its function." Carl Westing, who had been standing quietly in the doorway to the kitchen, said, "You want some coffee before you do this?" They had coffee. Carl asked about Lena, not about the mechanics of what had happened, but about her. What she was like. Mara talked, and Carl listened, and when she was done he nodded in the way that old men nod when they are recognizing something rather than agreeing with it. "I had a granddaughter used to hum to herself like that," he said. "Drove her mother crazy. I used to listen for it from the next room." He stood up and said he would be in the kitchen if they needed him, and that they could take as long as they needed, and that he hoped with considerable force that it worked. Desmond pressed the painted canvas against the surface of the aperture. It was 4:18 in the afternoon. The light through Carl's western windows was long and gold, the kind of late daylight that painters plan for months to capture, that turns ordinary rooms into something they were not before and will not be again. Dust moved in the light. Carl's clock ticked in the kitchen. Outside, a bird that Mara could not see was making a sound that was almost musical, short and sharp and patient. Nothing happened for 11 minutes. Mara stood in the middle of Carl's living room and did not move. She had her arms crossed over her chest with each hand gripping the opposite shoulder. She was not crying. She had cried an ocean in 11 months, and now she had reached the bedrock beneath the crying. A dry, absolute attention. Every part of her focused on the white rectangle on the wall with the fierce, unreasonable mammalian stubbornness. That is one of the things human beings have, and the curators, for all their ancient wisdom and their vast collections, most certainly do not. She hummed. She did not decide to hum. It simply came out of her D minor, no specific melody, the same key Lena hummed in, the frequency of their shared household, the sound their home made when everyone was safe inside it. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds, the white of the painting changed. Not dramatically, not with a sound or a flash. It simply became more itself, the not white deepening slightly, the corners breathing more noticeably, the sense of depth resolving at last into an actual depth, a passage, an interior that went somewhere rather than nowhere. Desmond did not let go of his canvas. And then the light in the passage shifted, and Mara saw movement, and her breath stopped and did not restart, and her daughter stepped out of the white. Lena was exactly the same age. That was the first thing. 11 months had not touched her. She was 9 years old, dark-haired, slightly smudged around the hands the way she always was, wearing the green jacket she had been wearing in the gallery. Her eyes went wide when they found Mara, and she said, "Mama," in the particular voice she used when she was just on the edge of crying but had not decided yet whether to give in, and she crossed the room in 4 steps and was caught. Mara did not say anything. She held her daughter against her chest and breathed, and her breathing was the only sound in the room for a long time, and behind her Desmond carefully stepped back from the painting with his canvas, and the aperture closed and was just white again and nothing more. Carl Westing appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the two of them, and his face did the thing that old faces do when they have witnessed something they were not expecting to ever witness this late in their lives. "I'll put on more coffee," he said. Later, much later, when Lena was asleep on Carl's sofa under a quilt Carl had retrieved from a cedar chest with the careful efficiency of a man who had once been a very good father, Mara and Desmond sat at Carl's kitchen table, and Mara asked Lena's question. Lena had told them, in fragments and hesitations, and with the thoughtful inexactness of a 9-year-old describing something she did not have adult vocabulary for, what the exhibition was like. It was not frightening, she said. It was not painful. It was like being inside a painting, which was the most accurate description available to her, and possibly the most accurate description available to anyone. It was vast and white and geometrically precise, and there were other people there, other beings, things she had not recognized as beings at first because they did not look like anything in her experience. They had not hurt her. They had looked at her, not cruelly, not clinically. The way, she said, groping for the comparison, the way people look at things they think are beautiful and want to keep. "They didn't think they were doing anything wrong," Mara said to Desmond. "No," he said, "I don't think they did. They took my daughter because they thought she was art." "From what I understand of them," Desmond said carefully, "I think they considered it a form of preservation, a kind of high honor in their framework. Something too valuable to leave at risk of loss." Mara held her coffee cup with both hands. She looked at the table. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I understand that they are ancient and intelligent, and that by their own values they may have meant no harm. I am not confused about any of that." "Okay," Desmond said. "And I want to be equally clear that it doesn't matter." Desmond said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "They took a child," Mara said. "Whatever their framework, whatever their age, whatever their intentions. They took a 9-year-old child from her mother in the middle of an afternoon and held her for 11 months in a space with no sky and no sound and no one who knew her name. And they will do it again. To someone else's child. To anyone who gets close enough to touch." The clock ticked. The bird outside had stopped singing hours ago. "I agree," Desmond said. "Can we close the apertures?" He had thought about this. He had been thinking about it since Osaka, probably, in the way you think about something when you are not yet sure you are thinking about it. "I believe so," he said. "The translation framework, the authentication signal I used tonight works as a resonant match, but the notation also describes a counter-resonance function. A signal that doesn't authenticate a subject for retrieval but instead disrupts the aperture's structural coherence, closes it permanently." He paused. "I don't know what that does to anything currently archived inside. The notation doesn't address it." Mara was quiet for a long time. "Are there other people in there?" "I don't know, probably. The Copenhagen disappearance, the Osaka disappearance. Others I may not have found. Others before I started looking." "Then we can't just close them." "No. We need to get everyone out first." "Yes." Another silence. Mara turned her coffee cup in her hands around and around, a slow rotation, something to do while thinking. So we need to do what you did tonight, she said. For every person who was taken, paint them, prove them, transmit the pattern. I would need information about every archived subject, the same kind of information you gave me about Lena, the pattern of them. What made them specifically themselves? Where would you get that? Missing persons cases, families, the same way you looked for Lena through the people who knew them well enough to love them. Mara set down her coffee. She looked at Desmond across the table with the direct, leveling attention that he was beginning to understand was her primary mode of engagement with the world. You'd need help, she said. Researchers, people who can find the families, people who can gather the details, artists who can do what you do. Probably, he said. You've been working on this alone for 15 years. I didn't have a translation framework until now, he said. I didn't know it was possible. Is it possible? He thought about the painting he had made, the 9 days. The sensation of reaching into the geometry of a person's existence and mapping it, rendering it in a language old enough to predate every human art form. He thought about whether other painters could be taught that language. He thought about Mara's speed with the translation, her surveyor's spatial logic finding a purchase in the curator's notation that had surprised them both. Yes, he said, I think it's possible. She nodded. She picked up her coffee again. Then we should start planning, she said. In the years that followed, they did not move quietly. Mara returned to work, not environmental surveying, but something adjacent. She built the thing she had told Desmond they needed, incrementally and with the specific methodical stubbornness that had kept her going through 11 months of official indifference. She called it the Aperture Project, which was deliberately unassuming, the kind of name that sounded like a photography collective or a tech startup, and attracted no attention from the people who would have tried to shut it down. She identified researchers in 6 countries. She cultivated relationships in missing persons networks. She began building a database of disappearances that matched the Aperture pattern specific criteria. No body, no evidence of foul play, a prior presence at an art venue, a witnessed vanishing with no physical explanation that had been quietly shelved by officials who were not willing to put anomalous contact event on a report. The list grew faster than she had expected. 33 cases in the first 2 years, 47 by the end of the 3rd year. People of every age from 11 countries, taken over a span of decades in some cases, spanning back as far as 60 years in one documented instance. A jazz musician in New Orleans who had disappeared from an experimental gallery in 1963 and whose family had spent 2 generations quietly insisting that something about it had not been right. Desmond taught the language to 6 painters. Not quickly, the learning curve was steep, and the application was not intuitive, requiring both the syntactical knowledge and what he could only describe as a kind of felt understanding of the person being translated. Not every painter had both. 2 of the 6 he recruited early proved to have the translation capacity without the empathic depth, producing patterns that were technically fluent but emotionally inert, close to a signature but not the signature itself, the difference between a copy and an original. He let them go gently and kept looking. He found them in places he did not expect. A muralist in Accra who worked primarily on government commissions but made private pieces, always given away, always depicting someone specific, that the people who received them described as uncannily precise, like being seen from the inside. A textile artist in Oaxaca who wove pattern that her clients reported made them feel recognized in a way that portrait photography never had. A young painter in Seoul who had been working in a language he had invented himself, whose structures were different from Desmond's but equally valid, a parallel translation reached from a different direction. And eventually, Mara herself. She had not thought of herself as an artist. She was a surveyor. She mapped existing terrain. But the skills, it turned out, were less different than either of them had assumed. What Desmond called painting the geometry of a person, Mara recognized as a kind of survey, reading the specific landscape of an individual existence and rendering it accurately. She had been doing this her whole life. She had not known there was a notation that could formalize it. She learned fast. She had always learned fast. The retrievals began in the second year. The jazz musician from New Orleans was one of the first. His family, spanning 3 generations, provided the information Desmond needed, and the account that came from his granddaughter, a woman in her 50s who had never known her grandfather and described only what her own grandmother had told her, was detailed enough. He was found and returned through an aperture in a storage facility in Belgium, where the piece that had taken him had been sitting in a private collection for decades, moved and removed and ultimately forgot by an estate too large and too old to track its own inventory. He stepped out of the white and stood in a Belgian storage facility in his 1963 clothes, with his 1963 face, unchanged, holding a saxophone case he had not put down. He looked around at the crates and the fluorescent lighting and Desmond standing there with a canvas, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "Well, that was something." Not everyone came back like that. Some had been in the exhibition for decades, and they were changed by the duration in ways that were hard to articulate, not damaged, exactly, but altered in some deep register, like a piece of music played in a different key than it was written in. The original harmonics were still there, but they rang differently now. Some of them needed time and care and professional support. Some of them found, after a while, that they were entirely themselves again and entirely grateful. Some found they were never quite sure where the seam was. Lena grew up alongside all of this. She was not shielded from it. Mara had considered shielding her and rejected it, not because she was callous about the experience her daughter had survived, but because Lena was not fragile. She was, in fact, one of the least fragile people Mara had ever known, including all the adults, and because the work they were doing was real and the world was what it was, and pretending otherwise served no one. At 12, Lena helped compile missing persons research. At 15, she was conducting family interviews. At 17, she had a facility for the translation notation that came so naturally and so fast that Desmond quietly told Mara it was the most intuitive uptake he had ever seen, and that he thought Lena might have retained something from her time in the exhibition, some residual fluency with the curator's language. The way a person retains a second language learned in early childhood even if they stop using it. Lena, when told this, considered it for a moment and said, "That makes sense." It was a long time to listen. By the time Lena was 20, they had retrieved 61 people from 11 apertures across 3 continents. They had identified 14 more apertures, including 2 in institutional collections that had not triggered a disappearance in years but remained active. They had closed, permanently, 7 apertures where the archived subjects had been recovered, and the structures could safely be disrupted. The closings were done with a second type of transmission, Desmond's counter-resonance signal, rendered not in a single canvas, but in a coordinated broadcast from multiple painters working simultaneously, their individual pattern languages combining into something more powerful than any one of them alone. The first closing had taken 3 attempts. By the 5th, they had it in 1. The curators did not respond to the closings, not directly. There was no retaliation, no contact, no signal of any kind from wherever they existed, whatever that existence was. The apertures simply went dark when the counter-resonance struck them, that specific white dimming first to gray, and then to the ordinary white of paint on canvas, the depth vacating from them, the sense of breathing corners going still. Whether the curators knew what was happening, whether they registered it at all, whether an intelligence that operated on geological timescales even perceived these events as occurring in meaningful time, none of this was answerable. Mara thought about it sometimes, driving alone or standing in Lena's old room which had long since stopped being preserved and become simply a room used for other things. The planet mobile gone and the stones redistributed, the lavender smell replaced by whatever the room was now. She thought about them the way she thought about institutions. Large, ancient, self-certain things that had built their frameworks over so much time that they had stopped questioning the frameworks. Things that had decided, somewhere in their deep past, what was valuable and how it should be treated, and had not revisited that decision in so long that revisiting it was not part of their operational vocabulary. She bore them no hatred. She held them no grace. She just kept closing the doors. The 60-second retrieval was different. The aperture was in a small museum in Lisbon, a private collection that had been open to the public for 40 years, founded by a Portuguese merchant family whose patriarch had assembled it in the 1950s. The piece had been in the collection since 1971, acquired in what the family's records described only as a private sale of international origin. It was displayed in a side gallery, well lit, behind a rope barrier that prevented close approach. The barrier had been added in 1989 after a visitor reported feeling unwell while standing nearby. No one had been lost through it, as far as anyone could establish. But the notation on the surface, which Mara had examined on a reconnaissance visit the previous month, described an interior population of two archived subjects, both present. No dates, no identification, only pattern signatures so old. The notation's structural age markers suggested they had been in the exhibition for upward of 80 years. That the translation was difficult, like reading in a language that had shifted significantly since the document was written. She and Desmond spent 3 weeks on the pattern signatures. At the end of the 3 weeks they had partial profiles, a man and a woman, approximate ages at time of archival, mid-20s. They had been taken together, apparently, which the notation flagged as unusual. The curator's collection system was designed for individual subjects, and two together created a resonance pattern that the aperture had noted as anomalous, a kind of double signature that had apparently locked the aperture in an active state as it tried to resolve two patterns simultaneously and had never been able to. They had been in there since approximately 1944. Finding families for subjects archived 80 years ago was not easy. It required the researchers Mara had built her network with weeks of genealogical investigation, coordination with archivists in 3 countries. Slowly, a picture assembled. A French painter, Louis Moreau, and his assistant Simon Chakes, both from Lyon, both documented as missing in the spring of 1944. Both had been associated with a series of wartime exhibitions organized through a network of private collectors. Exhibitions that had continued through the occupation, quietly, under the radar of the German administration, because art was the one language the occupation found difficult to fully censor without the effort appearing as what it was. Moreau's great-grandniece was alive and in her 30s and found them through the genealogical search. She had a photograph of him. She had letters. She had a detailed account from her grandmother, Louis's niece, who had known him well and written everything down with the particular compulsion of a person who knew that memory was fragile and wanted to be sure. Simon Chakes had no direct living descendants, but Mara found a woman who had been Simon's best friend's granddaughter, and the friend had also written things down, and what she had written described Simon in the kind of detail that only comes from having loved someone well. Mara painted Simon, Desmond painted Louis. They pressed the canvases against the aperture in the Lisbon Museum at closing time, with the director's knowledge and the building to themselves, the side gallery lit low, their footsteps echoing on old stone floors. They came out together. The man first, then the woman 2 steps behind him, still mid-sentence in a conversation that had apparently been happening when they were taken, their voices already in the room before they were fully in the room, French rapid and low, the sound of 2 people who had been talking to each other for years and had simply continued. Louis Moreau stopped and looked at the stone floor and the low gallery lights and Desmond standing there with a canvas, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that moved too quickly to name. Simone Chakes, one step behind him, looked at the room and then at Mara. It worked, she said, in French, then in English, because she had seen Mara's face and known. It worked. It worked, Mara said. Louis was still looking at the room. He reached out and touched the stone wall beside the aperture, now gray, now just paint, now nothing, with a tentative, confirming pressure, as though testing whether it was real. Then he put his hand flat against it and left it there, and did not say anything for a while. Simone had turned to look at him. She had the expression of someone who had looked at this particular person so many times, and in so many kinds of light, that looking at him was not a single act but a practiced one, layered, composed of all the previous lookings. She reached out without looking away from him and found Mara's hand and held it. "How long?" she asked. 81 years, Mara said. A pause, then, "What year is it?" 2025. The man said something in French. Simone answered him in French. Then she turned back to Mara, still holding her hand, and said, "We'll need help understanding." "We know," Mara said. "We're prepared for that. You'll have everything you need." "What is your name?" "Mara." "How did you find the way to do this?" Mara looked at her across 81 years and the width of a language that was older than human civilization, and thought about Lena's hand in hers in Carl Westing's living room, and Desmond's 9 days of painting, and the hum in D minor, and the river stones arranged by color, and all the families who had given them details, and all the painters who had learned a language they were not supposed to know. "A painter figured out the language," she said, "and a mother was too stubborn to stop." Simone squeezed her hand. She nodded in the way that the newly returned sometimes nodded, not as an agreement, but as an acknowledgement of weight received, held, understood. They walked out of the gallery into the Lisbon night, the four of them, into a city that Louis and Simone would spend months learning to inhabit, into a century that would take longer, into a world that was still full of apertures they had not found yet, and people they had not retrieved, and doors that still needed closing. But the night was warm, and the city was lit, and somewhere above the rooftops the stars were doing what stars do, which is simply being there, not malevolent, not benevolent, just ancient and numerous and permanent in the way that existence itself is permanent, which is to say not permanent at all, just longer than any one perspective can easily hold. Mara tilted her head back and looked up at them. She had been afraid of the sky for a while, for about 11 months to be precise, the sky as container of the thing that had her daughter, the thing she could not reach, the vast and indifferent dark. She had made herself stop being afraid by the simple tactic of refusing to afford it that power. The sky was not an adversary. It was not a symbol. It was a place, like any other place, and places could be navigated if you read them correctly. She was a surveyor. That was what she did. Louis was looking up at the same sky with a different expression, something closer to wonder, the expression of a man re-encountering something he had not expected to see again. He said something in French, quietly. Desmond caught her eye and lifted his chin slightly, asking if she wanted the translation. She shook her head. She did not need it. She already knew. There were 14 apertures still active. There were at least 22 identified archived subjects. There were 6 painters in the network and room for more. There was work, and more work after that, and she was going to do it. She was going to do it because Lena had come back to her through a door that no one was supposed to be able to open, because a painter she had never met had driven through the night on a hunch and shared his notebook at 2 in the morning, because a retired mining engineer in Montana had made them coffee and called the chair by the window a good chair for thinking, because Simone Chakes's best friend's granddaughter had saved a box of letters that described a woman now standing 30 feet away in a Lisbon side street, blinking at the 21st century. Because humans were stubborn and persistent and deeply, unreasonably attached to each other, and no species in the universe, however old, however vast, however well-intentioned, had yet found a way to properly account for that. She lowered her eyes from the stars. "All right," she said, "let's get to work."